Working at the 24-hour laundromat seemed easy until I found the rules taped inside the dryer. My name is Marcus, and I need a job that won't interfere with my day classes. Community college isn't cheap, and the spin and dry laundromat on Maple Street offered exactly what I needed. $15 an hour to sit in a fluorescent-lit box from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., occasionally helping customers and making sure no one steals the quarters from the machines. The owner, Mrs. Chen, was a small woman in her 60s who spoke in clipped sentences and avoided eye contact. During my brief training shift, she showed me how to operate the change machine, how to unclog the industrial washers, and where the cleaning supplies were kept. "Simple job," she said, jangling her keys. "Most nights, very quiet. Just keep building secure, help customers if needed." She handed me a clipboard with basic maintenance logs and a ring of keys. "The important one," she explained. "Open the coin boxes for collection every morning. One thing," she added as she headed for the door, "if anything unusual happens, you call me immediately, day or night." I asked what she meant by unusual, but she was already gone, leaving me alone with the constant hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rumble of a washer entering its spin cycle. The first week was exactly as advertised. A handful of customers trickled in during the evening hours. Shift workers, insomniacs, people whose apartments didn't have hookups. By 2 a.m., the place was usually empty except for me, and whatever book I had brought to pass the time. The laundromat itself was unremarkable. 20 washers along the left wall, 20 dryers along the right, with a row of folding tables down the middle. Vending machines hummed in the corner next to a small office that contained a desk, a safe, and a cot for breaks. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, and the linoleum floor was the color of old teeth. It was during my second week that I noticed the smell. At first, I thought it was just industrial detergent mixed with the general mustiness of an old building. But some nights, particularly when it rained, there was something else underneath. Something organic and unpleasant that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I mentioned it to Mrs. Chen when she came by to collect the weekend receipts. "Old building," she said, not looking up from her counting. "Sometimes pipes make smells." But it wasn't coming from the pipes. I worked enough odd jobs to know what sewer backup smelled like. This was different. Sweeter. On my 15th night, dryer number 14 started making a noise. It wasn't a normal tumbling sound. This was a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the inside of a drum. I assumed something was stuck, a loose button or forgotten coin, so I opened it up to check. The dryer was empty, but the smell hit me immediately. That same organic sweetness, now concentrated and overwhelming. I stepped back, covering my nose, and that's when I saw it. A small piece of paper taped to the inside of the drum, barely visible unless you were looking directly up into it. I peeled it off carefully. It was a typed list on yellowed paper, the kind you'd find in an old typewriter. At the top, in capital letters, it read, "Night shift rules." Below that, 10 numbered items. 1. Do not acknowledge customers who enter after 3:33 a.m. unless they speak to you first. 2. If you hear knocking from inside the machines, do not open them. Wait for the sound to stop. 3. The customer in the red coat will always use washer 7. Do not approach this machine while it is in use. 4. If the lights go out, remain at the front desk. Do not use a flashlight. The darkness will pass. 5. Never count the customers. If you find yourself doing so, start your count over immediately. 6. The lost and found box must be emptied before dawn. Do not look at the items inside. 7. If someone asks about the basement, tell them there isn't one. 8. Dryer 14 will sometimes contain items that were never put in. Remove them immediately and dispose of them in the dumpster outside. 9. The payphone in the corner works even when disconnected. If it rings, let it ring. 10. If you see yourself enter the building, do not leave the office until sunrise. I read the list 3 times, waiting for the punchline. It had to be a joke. Something left by a previous employee to mess with the new guy. But the paper felt old, genuinely old, and there was something about the specific details that made my skin crawl. I folded the paper and stuck it in my pocket, then checked the time. 2:47 a.m. The laundromat was empty, except for one customer. An elderly man in a brown jacket who'd been washing the same load for over an hour. I'd seen him before. He came in twice a week and always seemed to be washing the same pile of white sheets. At 3:30, I heard the bell above the door chime. I looked up from my textbook to see a woman in a red coat walking purposefully toward the washers. She was middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she moved with the mechanical precision of someone following a familiar routine. She went directly to washer #7. My mouth went dry. I pulled the paper from my pocket and reread rule number 3. The customer in the red coat will always use washer #7. Do not approach this machine while it is in use. The woman loaded her washing. I couldn't see what from my position at the desk, and fed quarters into the machine. The washer started its cycle, and she took a seat on the bench across from it, staring straight ahead with unblinking eyes. I tried to focus on my homework, but I kept glancing at the clock. 3:33 came and went. At 3:35, the bell chimed again. A young man entered, maybe college-aged like me, wearing jeans and a hoodie. He nodded in my direction and headed for an empty washer. I started to wave back, then remembered rule number 1. Do not acknowledge customers who enter after 3:33 a.m. unless they speak to you first. I kept my hand down and watched as he loaded his laundry. He seemed normal enough. Tired. Probably coming home from a late shift somewhere. But there was something about the way he moved. Something too fluid, like he was floating slightly above the ground. At 4 a.m., I heard the knocking. It came from dryer #8. A steady tap-tap that cut through the ambient noise of the other machines. I remembered rule number 2 and forced myself to stay in my chair. Even as the knocking grew louder and more insistent, the woman in red didn't seem to notice. Neither did the young man, who was now sitting on a bench scrolling through his phone. The knocking continued for exactly 5 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. By 4:30, I was questioning my sanity. Maybe the job was getting to me. Maybe I'd been reading too many horror stories between customers. Maybe the rules were just someone's elaborate prank, and I was letting my imagination run wild. Then the lights went out. The laundromat plunged into absolute darkness. The hum of the fluorescent fixtures died, and even the washers and dryers went silent. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat and the sound of rain beginning to fall outside. I reached for my phone to use as a flashlight, then stopped. Rule number 4. If the lights go out, remain at the front desk. Do not use a flashlight. The darkness will pass. I sat perfectly still, hands folded on the desk, and waited. The darkness wasn't empty. I could sense movement, not threatening, exactly, but purposeful. Like the building itself was shifting, rearranging, becoming something else entirely. I heard footsteps that didn't quite sound like footsteps, and whispers that might have been the wind. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the lights flickered back on. The washers and dryers resumed their cycles. The woman in red was gone, but her washer was still running. The young man sat in exactly the same position, still scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. I checked the time. 4:47 a.m. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move independently, and every sound felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. When Mrs. Chen arrived at 7 a.m. to open the day shift, I was waiting by the door with my jacket already on. "Everything okay?" she asked, noting my obvious eagerness to leave. I almost told her about the rules, about the woman in red and the darkness. Instead, I just nodded and headed for my car. At home, I spread the paper on my kitchen table and read through the rules again in daylight. They seemed less ominous in my apartment, surrounded by familiar things, just words on old paper. But I couldn't forget the knocking, or the way the young man had moved, or the absolute certainty I had felt that something was fundamentally wrong with the world between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. at the Spin and Dry Laundromat. I considered quitting. I needed the money, but I also needed my sanity. In the end, I decided to give it another week. Maybe it had been a fluke. Maybe I'd imagined most of it. The next night, I arrived at work with a notebook and pen. If weird things were going to happen, I was going to document them. Maybe I could find a pattern, some explanation that didn't involve the supernatural. The first few hours were normal. A handful of customers came and went, all leaving before the witching hour of 3:03 a.m. I used the quiet time to study and tried not to think about the rules folded in my wallet. At 3:15, I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice coming from outside. I was talking to someone, laughing, getting closer to the door. But I was sitting at the desk, alone with my mouth firmly shut. The bell chimed, and I watched myself walk in. The other me was wearing the same clothes, carrying the same backpack, but there was something off about his movements. They were too precise, too deliberate, like someone trying very hard to appear normal. Rule number 10. If you see yourself enter the building, do not leave the office until sunrise. I quietly slipped into the small office behind the front desk and locked the door. Through the window, I could see the other me taking position at the desk, settling in with a book just as I had an hour earlier. For the next 3 hours, I watched myself work. The other me helped the customer with the change machine, emptied a lint trap, and even waved at someone I couldn't see. He moved through the routine flawlessly, but there was something uncanny about it, like watching a recording of myself played back at slightly the wrong speed. At 6:47 a.m., just as the sky was beginning to lighten outside, the other me stood up, gathered his things, and walked out the door. The bell chimed once, and then silence. I waited until 7 a.m. exactly before leaving the office. Mrs. Chen arrived 5 minutes later to find me standing by the door, pale and shaken. "You look sick," she observed. "I think I might be," I said. That afternoon, I called in sick for the first time since I'd started. I needed time to think, to process what I'd seen. I spent the day researching the building's history, looking for some rational explanation for the rules and the things I'd witnessed. The Spin and Dry Laundromat had been built in 1987 on the site of an old boarding house that had burned down in 1986. 16 people had died in the fire, most of them overnight guests who'd been trapped on the upper floors. The cause had been ruled accidental, a faulty electrical wire in the basement. But some survivors reported strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to the fire. Knocking sounds from inside the walls, lights going out for no reason, guests who claimed to have seen themselves in the hallways. I found a newspaper article from 1987 that mentioned the construction of the laundromat. The developer had bought the lot for well below market value, and construction had been plagued by accidents and delays. 3 workers had quit, citing an oppressive atmosphere and a feeling of being watched. The laundromat had changed hands 5 times since opening. Each owner had sold quickly, always to someone willing to pay cash and ask few questions. When I returned to work the following night, I brought a digital camera and a voice recorder. If I was going to document the impossible, I wanted evidence. Mrs. Chen was waiting for me when I arrived. "We need to talk," she said. She led me into the office and closed the door. For a long moment, she just stared at me with those sharp, dark eyes. "You found the rules," she said finally. It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer. "How many have you seen?" "All of them," I said. "The woman in red, the knocking, the lights going out. I saw myself walk in last night." She nodded slowly. "That's faster than most. Usually takes a month or 2 before they start showing themselves. The ones who died here, in the fire, they're confused. They think the building is still the boarding house. They think it's still 1986. I stared at her. "You knew about this when you hired me. I hope you wouldn't see them. Some people don't. They work their shifts, collect their paychecks, never notice anything unusual. But you're sensitive. They're drawn to people like you. Why didn't you warn me?" Mrs. Chen sighed. "Would you have taken the job if I'd told you a place was haunted?" She had a point. "The rules," I said. "Who wrote them?" "The first night shift worker who could see them. A young man named David, back in 1988. He worked here for 3 months, documenting everything he saw. The rules were his way of coexisting with them." "What happened to it?" "He disappeared one night in November. Just gone. His car was still in the parking lot, his jacket was still on the chair, but David was never found." My mouth went dry. "And you still hire people for the night shift?" "The laundromat needs to stay open. The bank requires 24-hour operation to maintain our commercial loan. And honestly, most people don't see them. You're only the 3rd person in 35 years who's experienced all 10 rules. What happened to the 2nd person?" Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. "She lasted 6 months. Then one night, she called me at 3 a.m., screaming about something in the basement. When I got here, she was gone too. Just like David. There is no basement," I said, remembering rule number 7. "No," Mrs. Chen agreed. "There isn't. But sometimes they think there is." I looked around the small office, suddenly aware of how trapped I felt. "I can't do this job anymore." "I understand. I'll pay you through the end of the week. Or about tonight, I'll cover it myself. I've done it before." Mrs. Chen wasn't sensitive like I was. She'd worked hundreds of night shifts over the years and never seen anything more unusual than a drunk customer. For her, the laundromat was just a building with some odd quirks and a tragic history. But as I gathered my things and prepared to leave, I realized I couldn't just walk away. Not entirely. "The rules," I said, "they work, don't they? They keep people safe. As far as I know, yes. David was very thorough. Then someone needs to update them. Add to them. Make sure the next person who can see them has the best possible chance of surviving." Mrs. Chen raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting? 1 more week? Let me document everything I can. If I'm going to quit anyway, I might as well make it count." She agreed reluctantly. For the next 7 nights, I became an anthropologist of the supernatural. I documented every anomaly, every pattern, every rule violation, and its consequences. I learned that the woman in red was named Eleanor, and she'd been a guest in room 7 of the old boarding house. The young man who entered after 3:33 was Tommy, a college student who died trying to escape through a 2nd-floor window. The knocking sounds came from Mr. Henley, who'd been trapped in his room and had spent his final hours pounding on the walls for help. The darkness was a recreation of the power outage that had preceded the fire, and the payphone rang with calls from people trying to reach loved ones who would never answer. Most importantly, I learned why the rules worked. The spirits weren't malevolent, just confused and trapped in a loop of their final night. The rules weren't about avoiding them. They were about not disrupting their routine, not reminding them that they were actually dead. Break the rules, and you risk shattering their fragile existence. And when traumatized spirits suddenly realize they're dead, they sometimes take the living with them. On my final night, I updated David's list. 11. The elderly man in the brown jacket is washing his burial shroud. He died in his sleep and doesn't know he's dead. Let him be. 12. If you smell smoke, don't panic. It's just a memory. Open the windows and the smell will fade. 13. Room numbers sometimes appear on the dryer doors. This is normal. Don't mention it to customers. 14. If a customer asks you to call the fire department, tell them it's already been done. They'll understand and leave peacefully. 15. Never touch items left behind by customers who enter after 3:33 a.m. They're not really there. I taped the updated list inside dryer hash 14, exactly where I'd found the original, and left a note for Mrs. Chen explaining what I'd learned. My replacement started the following Monday. His name was Jake, a pre-med student who needed a quiet place to study. Mrs. Chen warned him about the quirky atmosphere and the importance of following any written instructions he might find. I never asked whether Jake could see them. I didn't want to know. 6 months later, I was working at a bookstore near campus when I saw Mrs. Chen in the local newspaper. The Laundromat had finally been sold to a developer who planned to tear it down and build condos. The last night shift would be October 31st, Halloween night. I couldn't help myself. I drove by the Laundromat that evening and parked across the street. Through the windows, I could see Jake at the front desk, reading what looked like a medical textbook. The fluorescent lights hummed, the machines tumbled, and everything looked normal. At 3:33 a.m., I saw the woman in a red coat enter the building. She walked directly to washer hash 7, just as she had every night for over 30 years. Jake didn't look up from his book. At 3:35, a young man in a hoodie followed her in. He moved with that same fluid, otherworldly grace I remembered. Jake continued reading. At 4 a.m., I heard the knocking, faint but unmistakable, even from across the street. Jake didn't react. The lights went out at 4:30. For 5 minutes, the building sat in complete darkness while Jake waited patiently at his desk. When the lights came back on, he returned to his studying as if nothing had happened. He couldn't see them. He was one of the lucky ones. The Laundromat closed for good the next morning. By December, it had been demolished. The developer built a row of luxury condos on the site, and as far as I know, the new residents have never reported anything unusual. Sometimes I wonder if the spirits found peace when their physical anchor was destroyed, or if they simply moved on to haunt whatever came next. I hope it's the former, but I honestly don't know. What I do know is that some jobs are harder than they appear, and some rules exist for reasons that can't be explained in any employee handbook. I also know that there are places in this world where the boundary between life and death is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes all that stands between us and the darkness is a list of rules taped inside a dryer. I never worked another night shift. Some experiences change you in ways you can't undo. And once you've seen the other side of reality, it becomes impossible to pretend it doesn't exist. But I kept the original list of rules folded in my wallet as a reminder that the world is stranger and more dangerous than most people know, and that sometimes the only thing protecting us from the impossible is someone brave enough to work the graveyard shift and follow the rules, no matter how crazy they might seem. Working at the 24-hour laundromat seemed easy until I found the rules taped inside the dryer. After that, nothing seemed easy ever again. But at least I understood why the rules were there and why they mattered. In a world full of mysteries, that understanding felt like a small victory, even if it came at the cost of a good night's sleep.